everybody, I'm Astha Rath and I'm a legal faculty at CLATapult. So today we'll be looking at the trend that has been set in the last 5 years of CLAT papers with respect to legal reasoning section, starting with the year 2019. So in 2019, we had a previous pattern because of which a lot of static concepts were discussed. For example, in contracts, you saw the basic principles of acceptance, it being absolute. When is acceptance applicable with respect to whether it is sent to the promisor or when it is acknowledged by the promisor? We saw breach, we saw capacity. So these principles were very basic in contract. Similarly, in criminal law also, we saw something like theft, private defense, criminal force, murder, and then we look at torts. So in torts as well, we saw concepts like nuisance, negligence, defamation, vicarious liability. Again, things that you have an idea of if you have a basic knowledge of these principles in torts, criminal law, contracts, as well as constitutional law. Very few miscellaneous topics were discussed. One being the right to vote and any sort of interference with it. Another one being that if there is any sort of communication between spouses that is not admissible in court. So these were very few in number. Mostly they looked at the basic concepts of contracts, constitutional law, torts, and criminal law. So moving to 2020, there was less focus on these concepts, especially in contracts. So in contracts, we only saw a passage on force majeure, also because they were looking at COVID-19, and this was also the first year that the new pattern had been introduced, which was the long format passages which you had to refer to answer questions. That is what we saw in contracts. Now, when you come to IPC, there were certain things like obscenity. For obscenity, they gave you an idea of the Hicklin test and community standard test. Moving to torts, there was absolute liability and strict liability and the differentiation between the two. Similar in terms of the things that you learn with respect to the basics that you learn. Further than that, you could see that some of the passages were taken from basic websites online, one being IT Leaders, the other being the Hindu, Indian Express, etc. Then for constitutional law, there was Article 19 and Article 32. So Article 32 with the writ jurisdiction and 19, which means I think they focused on the freedom of speech and expression. For miscellaneous topics, again, very interesting. They only had one passage on miscellaneous topics, which was on ex post facto laws. In 2021, we look at the fact that in contracts, there was communication when complete, which is acceptance when complete. They also looked at consensus ad idem, which is same thing in the same sense. Moving on, there was nothing on criminal law, which is quite interesting. And then in terms of torts, there was voluntary non-fit injuria, which is when you voluntarily put yourself up to harm, then you cannot ask for damages with respect to that particular harm being caused to you. Moving ahead, there was something on miscellaneous topics as well. On miscellaneous topics, number one was res judicata. So now res judicata essentially states that if you have one claim against one party and you go to one court, you have to sustain or ensure that that court gives you the judgment and you abide by it. Now, obviously, you can appeal against that judgment. You can ask for a review petition or revision on it. However, you cannot be filing the same matter in different courts against the same party. Another thing that they looked at was family law. And under family law, there was something on Hindu Marriage Act. So that is again an interesting thing that we have to take into consideration. So in 2022, we saw lesser reliance on static topics like contracts, constitutional law, torts, criminal law. In fact, criminal law and torts were actually missing from many of the passages that were there. In contracts, there was one passage on mistake, and that looked at whether or not something that is essential to the agreement, whether or not if there's a mistake with respect to it, what are the repercussions of that? Other than that, in terms of constitutional law, there was one passage on right to religion and another on certain restrictions that can be placed on your right to move freely and reside anywhere in India. Other than that, there were only miscellaneous topics. In miscellaneous topics, one passage was on judicial authority of the High Court. Second passage was again under the realm of family law with respect to bigamy. Another passage was on Special Marriage Act, divorce under Special Marriage Act. Then there was international law and domestic law. So we looked at the concepts of dualism and monoism, which is very interesting, hasn't really been introduced in CLAT before. Other than that, there was something on environmental law as well with respect to sustainable development. Now coming to 2023, which is the latest CLAT. In that, there's only one topic from any sort of static that you might have learned, which comes from criminal law here. And in criminal law, this is under Article 498A, which is with respect to cruelty in marriage. Other than that, everything in the 2023 legal section was from miscellaneous topics and amendments that had been introduced either in the year 2021, 2022 or like somewhere contemporary in that timeline. So number 1 was with respect to Criminal Procedure Identification Act 2022 amendment. Number 2 was Electoral Bond Scheme, which was amended from 2018. Then Twitter asking reasons of the government when it wants any of the profiles to be blocked. That is a judgment that was contemporary and a passage came on that. Another one was free legal aid under the NALSA Act. Then the Anuradha Bassin judgment with respect to the fact that if you want any sort of internet shutdown, you need to provide reasons for it and it has to fall under the reasonable restrictions under the constitutional law. Then the National Medical Eligibility Test and the Consumer Protection Law were also discussed. So as we noticed, we began from a 2019 where a lot more focus was on these static topics, including constitutional law, contracts, torts, and criminal law. But now with 2023 finally showing us that the CLAT consortium is looking at more and more of the contemporary laws, amendments, case laws that are happening in the country. Now, how do you keep a track of it? Number 1, create a copy for yourself where you, as I am sure you have for your GK subject as well, create one for the legal reasoning section where you look at all the legal contemporary topics that are being discussed in this year's timeline and also the last year's timeline. So you will be looking at any sort of new amendments that have been brought up. An example could be the fact that there is a BNS bill currently at play. You can look at all the new and important case laws that are being discussed about. Now, how do you understand what is important and what is not? Look at contemporary websites for it. Number 1 could be Live Law. Number 2 could be SEC Online. You could even look at iPleaders, given that iPleaders is something that has been used for passages before by the CLAT consortium. So keep a track of the legal developments that are happening in the country, and through that, you'd be able to excel your legal reasoning passages. Thank you.